Okay, hi guys, it's Subhasha here. So today we're going to be looking at feminism. Great. Our overview, the first thing we're going to be looking at is just the basic definition of what feminism is. Then we're going to look at the different waves of feminism. We're also going to look at the various types of feminism that we get. We're going to look at some of the goals of the movement. And we're also going to look at some evaluations of like just the general ideas and ideologies that people have with regards to the movement. So, what is feminism, right? So, the way it all started was like there was this period in France where a philosopher called Christine de Pizan challenged the social restrictions on women and pushed for women's education. And then towards the 18th century in England, Mary Wollstonecraft, who she wrote something called a vindication of the rights of women. It became a seminal work of the English language feminist philosophy, right? And feminism in the United States has had a number of prominent activists during the mid to late 19th century. So notably, mainstream activists included Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, right? So less mainstream but similarly important views came from Sojourner Truth, who was a formerly enslaved black woman, and Emma Goldman, who is the nation's leading anarchist, who was the nation's leading anarchist during the 19th century. So, feminism has provided the Western women with increased educational opportunities, the right to vote, protections against workplace discrimination, and the right to make personal decisions about things like pregnancy. In some communities, feminism has also succeeded in challenging pervasive cultural norms about women. Outside the Western world, however, activists such as Malala Yousafzai have highlighted issues such as unequal access to education for women, right? So this slide just looks at and refers to the fact that feminism is a range of ideas and socio-political movements centered on the belief that women do face unequal treatment because of their gender and that society must establish some equality, right? It's important to understand that feminism looks at both sexes and genders being equal and not just women being superior over men, right? So let's move on to our next, looking at first wave feminism, right? So the first wave of feminism was originally the incarnation of the feminist movement, right? It was primarily focused on women's suffrages, so this was your suffragist movement that existed and limited to the 19th and 20th century. The legal rights of a woman achieved through the suffragist movement formed the basis of the future of the feminist waves. However, that suffragist movement was primarily a movement by and for white women only. There were some British Indian women involved in the movement, such as the Indian Princess Sophie, goddaughter of Queen Victoria. Overall, the first wave of feminism was not particularly diverse, right? And this began around in the 1850s and was focused on, like we said, the suffrage and thought to have ended with the passing of the 19th Amendment in the US in the 1920s. So that's when people thought that the first wave of feminism has ended. Okay. Now looking at the second wave of feminism, right? So the second wave of feminism began post World War II, right? And those involved in the second wave of feminism aimed to break the dichotomy between working men and stay-at-home mothers by giving women reproductive rights, including access to contraception and pushing sexuality into the spotlight. So this wave began the still present journey of trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment, written by Alice Paul in 1923, enacted. So the National Organization for Women was established, and their goal stated that they wanted to take action to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of American society, being able to exercise all privileges and responsibilities thereof in truly equal partnership with men. And it aimed to address six core issues, that being abortion, reproductive health service access, violence against women, constitutional equality, promoting diversity and ending racism, lesbian rights, as well as economic justice. So according to Martha Rampton, that the goals of the second wave of feminism has been achieved, including more women in leadership positions, abortion rights, acts that would involve, and then in terms of reproductive rights, they have access to the pill, more acceptance of female sexuality, and feminism as a field in academia, as well as things like women's support groups and efforts to reform and a critique of the patriarchy, right? So the backlash to this movement can still be seen today, as the older generations thought that the younger generations were kind of tearing part of the social fabric that existed and destroying the way things were supposed to be. So women of the feminist movement began to be seen as male-hating, promiscuous, and morally degenerate, right? So we can see where the problem arises when we talk about third wave second wave feminism, because particularly as much as it gained so much of things and women were able to get so much of things, there was a lot of backlash that existed with regards to this movement, right? Um, so we already spoke about the fact that it campaigned for all of these different things, and to be honest, it still has a very large influence on society, right? So while the ideals of second wave feminism are still seen, many of its values are now outdated. For example, a number of radical feminists from that specific period, such as Greer, are trans-misogynistic. So this doesn't fall in line with like the current aims of the feminist movement, and it's also regarded by many as an exclusive movement and not welcoming of different ethnicities and religions. So similar to first wave feminism, that was just exclusive to females, to white. Now we're looking at third wave feminism, right? So the third wave began in the early 1990s, rising from the pitfalls and missing issues of its predecessors. It focused much more on human rights and non-exclusionary feminism. So there are many scholars argued that this weavened through with the 2008 election of Barack Obama, right? However, some still feel that we are currently still in the third wave of feminism, and it's a decision for you guys to make whether we're in third wave feminism or whether we're progressing to fourth wave feminism at this point, right? And an attempt to destabilize constructs of universal womanhood and things like body, gender, sexuality, and heteronormativity are being made, right? So this wave also reclaimed many of the previous wave symbols of male oppression, including but not limited to things like lipstick, high heels, short skirts, and how how low your necklines are for women. It also focused on redefining and contextualizing gender and sexuality in terms of the way we perceive women. There were more radical factions of the third wave, things like self-named Riot Girls, who were hardcore and sought eschewing victimizing and reclaiming slurs used against them, right? So third wave feminism is also connected to something called anti-globalization as a world movement, right? So the globalization movement is something that is part of the reason that there is an arguable fourth wave that exists, right? So the transition into fourth wave feminism came as a product of this globalization and the increased prevalence of social media as a platform. So there's many young feminists that use social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook to expand the audience that they can reach on their own. So these people include Matt McRoy, something called Feminist Culture, like the Lexi Press. These are all like their Instagram handles. Um, but conversely, anti-feminism accounts also exist, and they have also found a large following on these websites as well. So anti-globalization as a movement opposes the homogenous ownership of the world labor industries for corporate profit, which ties heavily into capitalism and therefore lies at odds with socialist feminism, right? So the backlash of this movement was a more intensely radicalized view of feminism and added to the list of adjectives that was supposedly unfeminine and having a victim complex, right? So arguably the fourth wave of feminism is the backlash from the third wave. Though the issues are largely the same, with slightly more social awareness of different kinds and ways women experience oppression, younger women have increasingly internalized misogyny and the patriarchal values in, for example, American society, and are afraid to even identify themselves as feminists, though they may agree with the movement's claims and or goals, right? So here we can see that one of the major attempts of third wave feminism was to expand and diversify the feminist movement, which lacked in first and second wave feminism, right? And third wave feminism is also notable for its distinct sex positivity, though this is an idea that still currently divides certain. Now let's look at fourth wave feminism, right? So it could also be called cyber feminism, and this is used to describe the work of feminists interested in theorizing, critiquing, and making use of the internet, cyberplace, and new media technologies in general, right? So the term and movement grew out of third wave feminism. However, it's still unclear as to what the exact meaning of this movement is, right? So even at the first meeting of cyber feminists, which was called the First Cyber Feminist International in Germany, participants found it hard to provide a definition, and as a result of discussions, they proposed something called the 100 antithesis, right, with reference to Martin Luther King's thesis on what cyberfeminism is not, rather than what it actually is, right? So these included, for example, it is not an institution, it is an ideology, and that's something that's important, right? So cyberfeminism is considered to be the predecessor of networked feminism, which generally refers to feminism on the internet. For example, mobilizing people to take action against sexism, misogyny, or gender-based violence against women. So examples of this is like the Me Too movement that existed in 2017 online, right? Where there was a response on social media for all women all around the world, to the case of Harvey Weinstein, who was, the Hollywood producer who was essentially accused of harassing female staff in the movie industry. So the Me Too movement is a very good example of what fourth wave feminism looks like, right? Um, so similarly to third wave feminism, it's based on the value of intersectionality, embracing things like the LGBTQI plus community, as well as race theory, right? And fourth wave feminism is also strongly associated with reproduction and abortion rights, support of transgender women, and raising the voices of marginalized women, right? Next, we're going to different types of feminism. Now, this is a very, very broad category because there's so many different types of feminism that exist. So I've tried to put in a few that I think would be particularly important for you guys, right? So the first one we're looking at is radical feminism, right? So this is possibly one of the most controversial forms of feminism and therefore often ends up in the news or on social media for some of their views, right? But it's also very important to note that not all radical feminists think the same. So it's always important in debates to draw that spectrum of what people look like. And I think that that's something that's always lacking in speeches. You guys don't look at actors on a spectrum, but you kind of just either say the best or the worst in them. But there's always a middle ground that exists. It's important to use that, right? Um, so radical feminists believe that the patriarchy should ultimately be blamed for women's suffering. They view social institutions as inherently imbalanced in favor of men, and and argue that men have established and maintained dominance over women. So men are the social group who benefit the most from a woman's subordination, and therefore radical feminists see them as the main problem. So that is, men are the ruling class and women are the oppressed class. So since the root of women's subordination lies in patriarchy, radical feminists then believe that they will not be free until the patriarchy in and of itself is abolished, right? So people have varying views on radical feminism, right? So some people may think it's creating female-only communes which exclude men and provide a safe space for women to live in. Some feel that it's introducing a matrifocal family structure in which women are the heads of the family and men hold less powerful roles such as child rearing and household tasks, as well as things like political lesbianism. So this refers to women prioritizing relationships with other women regardless of sexual attraction in order to stop centering men in their lives. So political lesbians often view the idea of being heterosexual as sleeping with the enemy and therefore encourage celibacy or lesbianism. Um, then you have two types of radical feminists. You have your radical cultural feminists and you have your radical libertarian feminists. So in terms of your radical cultural feminists, these feminists believe that women are superior to men. They celebrate traditional feminine characteristics and shun those of men. For example, they welcome emotion and shun strength, which is considered to be a masculine quality, right? Then in terms of radical libertarian feminists, so they believe that it is possible to eradicate gender differences and they aim for there to be a little to no difference between the behaviors and characteristics of men and women. They look at cultural and social differences between genders, such as wearing dresses, and encouraging these attributes to be adopted by both genders and not just one. Something that's very important that like I need to say in this, right? Especially for like I think just anyone, not just like the males on the squad, but particularly you guys. Whenever you're having debates about feminism, it's very important to watch the words that you use when you're delivering speeches as well as the things that you guys say. Because, especially at nationals, people may take things in a way that you may not mean harm, but someone may think that you are saying it incorrectly. So always be careful of the words that you use when you're talking about women, when you're talking about disenfranchised people, when you're talking about minorities. If you're talking about people from the LGBTQI plus community, you have to refer to them in a way that is appropriate, but also one that conveys emotion and apathy, right? Even in debates where you're trying to argue, that the feminist movement has done more harm than good, for example, or that you don't want to associate females with these masculine characteristics such as power because that's what you associate with males because it's so masculine. You have to be very careful with the way that you phrase it. So it may be okay coming from a female, but if it's coming from a male, it may be viewed differently. So you can Make sure you're using expressions on your face, using air quotation marks to make sure you're making your adjudicators aware of the fact that you don't think of it this way, but this is what society perceives it to be. So next we're looking at reformist feminism, right? So reformist feminism believes that gender inequality can be eliminated through legislative or electoral reforms without the need to alter the capitalist system in and of itself. So we spoke about the groups such as the National Organization for Women or the Pro-Choice America. They typify a reformist feminism, right? Because they limit their efforts on to what can be achieved within the current system. They orient primarily to more privileged white middle class women, many of those whose needs can be at least partially or temporarily ameliorated by reforms, right? So their approach is a single issue and aimed at swaying politicians and donors. Then you have cultural feminism, right? So this emphasizes essential differences between men and women in terms of biology, personality, and behavior. Women are seen to have different and superior virtues that provide the foundation for a shared identity, solidarity, and sisterhood. Since by nature women are viewed as kinder and more gentle than men, it follows that if women were in power, the world would be a better place. So in the 60s and 70s, some women supported the idea of forming separate women-only cultures, right? Then we're going to move on to black feminism and liberal feminism. So in terms of black feminism, this kind of ties hand in hand with intersectionality, which we'll talk about later in our PowerPoint. So the school of thought argues that sexism, class oppression, gender identity, and racism are inextricably bound together. So the way these concepts relate to each other is called intersectionality, which I just spoke about, right? So the term intersectionality was a theory coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. In her work, she discussed that black feminism, which argues that the experience of being a black woman cannot be understood in terms of being black or being a woman, right? So each concept is considered independent but must include the interactions which frequently reinforce each other, right? Then in terms of liberal feminism, right? So this one is also important for you guys. So this focuses on general gender inequalities, not just specifically the position of women in society. So they believe that whilst inequalities exist, men and women both suffer. They view these inequalities as being replicated and encouraged through culture and socialization, rather than inherently patriarchal institutions in society, which is what radical feminism does the converse of. So, for example, children are taught the societal expectations of each gender from a young age. They learn the required behaviors associated with being a man or being a woman and embody them when they grow up and later pass them on to the next generation. So liberal feminists view the socialization of children into gender roles as extremely detrimental as they create strict ideas of gender that cannot be changed. They argue that education and socialization at a young age are vital in changing the views and changing these views that exist. Small changes within societal structures are key in adapting the way we view gender. So, for example, by wiping out the sexism seen in children's media products or the national curriculum for that matter. So, therefore, they believe that equality between genders can be achieved mainly through having equal opportunities in society. So some people argue that it's already been achieved to some extent through legal and social reform, for example, allowing women to enter the workforce. However, it's also important to note that women are still discriminated against more than men, and the liberal feminists do wish to change this. So they want to see more progress concerning equal opportunities by encouraging more legislation like the Equal Pay Act to be introduced, right? Then we're looking at transitional or global feminism, right? So transitional feminism is an approach to feminism that is concerned mainly about how globalization and capitalism affect people across nationalities, races, ethnicities, genders, classes, and sexualities, and has reinforced a range of global movements. So it recognizes inequalities across different groups of women and the importance of intersectionality as a way to understand and engage in these differences, right? So while global issues do not affect women in the same way because of these differences, the impact of these issues and power dynamics are seen to be crucial to feminist social justice agendas, right? And this vision understands the need for comprehensive approaches that integrate multiple issues and movements to find common cause across agendas to ensure long-term social transformation. Then you have ecofeminism. So this form of feminism views the patriarchy and its focus and control on focus on control and domination not only as a source of women's oppression, but also as being harmful to humanity as well as destructive of all living creatures and the earth in and of itself. So it combines a more comprehensive analysis of power, often with a greater spiritual vision. So they see women's rights and empowerment linked to political, social, cultural, economic, and factors that benefit all living creatures and Mother Nature in and of itself, hence ecofeminism. Then we have Marxist and socialist feminism, right? So Marxist and socialist feminism. Feminists are grounded in Marxist and socialist ways attributed to women's oppression, principally the capitalistic economic system where global corporate power prevails. So many other feminists believe that this form of power, seen in the class system, is a crucial factor in women's subordination, but see patriarchy as the major driving force behind women's subjugation, right? So it looks like the fact that the way in which men are remunerated for their labor in comparison to the way in which females maybe it's very different. That highlights the inequality that exists within the patriarchy, right? Then we're looking at cultural feminism, right? So cultural feminism emphasizes essential differences between men and women in terms of biology, personality, and behavior. Women are seen to have different superior virtues that provide the foundation for a shared identity, solidarity, and sisterhood. Since by nature women have been viewed as kinder and more gentle than men, it follows that if women were empowered, the world would be a better place. Now, I think we already looked at this, but anyways, my bad. Anyways, the last one we're going to look at is visionary feminism, right? So, the notion of visionary feminism, as seen in many writings of African American feminists, Bell Hooks, uh, combines the needs to challenge patriarchy, class, race, and other forms of oppression such as imperialism and corporate control. So, she focuses on love and the role of men. So, visionary feminism is a wise and loving politics. It is rooted in the love of male and female being. The soul of feminist politics is the commitment to ending patriarchal domination of women and men, girls and boys. Love cannot exist in any relationship that is based on dominance and coercion. Males cannot love themselves in patriarchal culture if their very self-definition relies on submission to patriarchal rules. So this particular slide is something that's very good that could form a basis for argumentation in a feminist debate and justifying why you would want to take down patriarchal structures. When men embrace feminist thinking and practice, which emphasizes the value of mutual growth and self-actualization in relationships, their emotional well-being will be enhanced. So a genuine feminist politics always brings us from bondage and to freedom, from lovelessness to loving. I think this is something that's very important. Like this shows you the example of the basis of which you should form argumentation, right? So it's the fact that saying that your premise could be the fact that men cannot love themselves in patriarchal culture if self-determined definition relies on submission to patriarchal rules. Okay, now we're going to look at some evaluations, right? So we're going to look through the different types of feminism and what people just generally think about them, right? So the first one we're looking at is radical feminism. So it's generally criticized by most modern media, like we spoke about. For example, real feminism is often seen to be overshadowed by radical feminists, right? And people found that it was seen in a negative light in the media, largely due to sensationalized headlines about men hating radical feminists rather than feminism as a whole. So you can see how it takes away from what the movement, or how this can warp people's perception of what the movement actually aims to do. So some of their beliefs are seen as extreme, particularly by the feminists, which results in women trying to separate themselves from the stigma. The consequence of this division between feminists, which sociologists argue will not help to solve the problem of women's oppression. In particular, radical cultural feminism is seen as extreme and man-hating. So we spoke about what radical cultural feminism is previously. Then in terms of liberal feminism, so they have ideas that have become mainstream in the recent decades and have helped to make real changes in women's life. So the main sociological critique of liberal feminism is that it does not consider how wide the issue of gender inequality is, right? So because they focus on the fact that everybody needs to be equal, they don't realize the intrinsic differences that exist between inequality of women in comparison to some inequality that may exist for men. Liberal feminism fails to acknowledge that the unequal positions of different genders are rooted deep within societal structures and have existed for centuries. And radical feminists typically argue that liberal feminism isn't ready to take more drastic action to protect women from oppression. Then we have postmodern feminism, right? So, postmodern feminism is where some sociologists argue that whilst the patriarchy still oppresses all women, it should be the main focus of feminism. That is, women should first and foremost tackle the biggest issue of all, which is patriarchy. Once this has been dealt with, then it will be much easier to focus on other forms of discrimination, right? So postmodern feminists choose not to focus on the difference between genders, but rather on the differences between and within different groups of women. They see gender as something we come to terms with over time, though the way we present ourselves to others, through the way we present ourselves to others. So it's fluid and dependent on the culture, norms, and values of each society. So this branch of feminism acknowledges that not all women come from the same social group and therefore face different degrees of discrimination. They also argue that the conventional branches of feminism tend to represent only white middle class women whilst ignoring women of other backgrounds. So they also highlight how women have different experiences, life chances, and opportunities due to factors such as their social class, ethnicity, religion, race, and sexuality. So although they all experience gender oppression and inequality, they don't experience it in the same way. So again, it's showing you a spectrum. So the struggles of a white woman is not the same as the struggles of a black woman, right? Postmodern feminists therefore want more recognition of struggles of women from a variety of diverse backgrounds. They're concerned with how power is distributed in society and opportunities that come along with this. So we also have a few things in like what functionist believe feminism is about, what Marxists believe feminism is about, and what just feminists think feminism is about. Okay, so you guys can read through it. Again, we're looking at some of the goals of the feminist movement, right? So in terms of the goals of the feminist movement, so the first thing is rethinking society with feminist theory, right? So this was accomplished by, among other disciplines, women's studies, feminist literary criticism, social feminism, as well as the feminist art movement. So they look through a feminist lens at history, politics, culture, economics, and they develop insights into just about every intellectual discipline. Then we're looking at abortion rights, right? So the call for abortion on demand is often misunderstood, and leaders of the women liberation movement were clear about the fact that women should have reproductive freedom and safe access to legal abortion, right? So something that's very, very important for you guys to know about is the Roe versus Wade case, because this was a very big changing turning point in terms of women's abortion rights and whether or not they had those reproductive rights, okay? And then we're looking at the desexing of the English language, right? So feminists help to spark debate over assumptions embedded in the English language that reflect the notion of male-dominated patriarchal society. So language is often centered around males, assuming that humanity was male and women were exceptions. This looked like the use of neutral pronouns, identifying words with gender bias, inventing new words. Many solutions were tried, and like we still talk about these things now, right? Then you have a few other things, which looks like education, equality legislation, promoting political participation. Political participation is something that's very important. So the League of Women Voters, which has existed since just after women won the vote, has supported educating women and men for that matter in informed voting and working to promote women as candidates, right? So that's important. Then it's also looking at things like rethinking women's roles in the home and whether or not they should be the ones taking care of kids or whether they should be able to go out and work and have a job. Then we're also looking at popular culture, which is a different type. So feminists critique the presence or non-presence of women in popular culture, and popular culture expanded the roles which women held. So TV shows gradually added women in more central and less stereotyped roles, including some shows featuring single women who wanted more than just to find a man, right? So movies also expanded roles, and female-driven comics saw the resurgence and widened audience with Wonder Woman leading the way. So this is also something that's very important because you often get debates of like, whether you portray females in a certain way or whether they should be the main character in a movie and those kind of things. Then the last one is the expanding of the voice of women. So as the feminist movement gained momentum, pressure on the union movement from the movement to represent more jobs of pink-collar jobs, mostly held by women, increased. So organizations like Women Employed were created for representing women in offices and where unions were not strong. So yeah, so it was just allowing them to have more voice and more leadership and be more represented within parties. Then we're looking at sexism and the different types of sexism. So with sexism, you have traditional sexism, you have modern sexism, and neo-sexism. So traditional sexism refers to supporting traditional gender roles, treating women as worse than men, employing traditional stereotypes which portray women as less competent than men. Modern sexism looks like denying discrimination. It is not the problem anymore, and having a negative attitude towards women's rights, denying the validity of claims made by women. And neo-sexism is a notion that refers to ideologies that justify discrimination towards women on the basis of competencies. So men are effectively better competent for some things, for example, managerial or leadership positions, and not on direct discrimination of women. So defenders of this idea tend to ignore or deny difficulties faced by women in society as having an influence on incompetencies. Then we're looking at intersectionality, right? So in terms of intersectionality, it was a term coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw that we spoke about in previously in 1989 to describe how different social categories interact, sometimes resulting in compounding effects and tensions. She wrote a paper that argued that discrimination specifically against black women is different from general anti-woman discrimination or anti-black racism. Instead, it involves the unique compound experience of both sexism and racism. So initially used in the context of discrimination law, the concept saw the resurgence of the 21st century in the 21st century among left-wing activists who broadened intersectionality to include categories such as class and sexual orientation, right? Then we're looking at thing which is just looking at a timeline of like important events that occurred in history that you guys should know about that like helped the movement progress, right? So the first thing that we saw was the Seneca Falls Convention. This was one of the starting points of the movement because this is when the 19th Amendment was passed that granted women the right to vote. That was a very important turning point in history. Then the next thing you had was the legislation of Wyoming, which passed the first women's suffrage law, which granted women the right to vote and hold office. Then the next thing we have was Rosa Parks, who helped launch the civil rights movement, which was also very important. And you also have the FDA in 1960, where they commissioned the first pill for reproductive rights that women could then looking at this, the next thing that we're looking at is the Equal Pay Act that John F. Kennedy signed into law, which is very important in terms of the gender pay gap that existed. And in 1973, very, very important, your Roe versus Wade to look at abortion rights and the right women have to abortion. Then you have the next one where you have an individual, Geraldine, who was able to become vice president. And lastly, in 2013, the ban against women serving in combat positions was removed. I'm just gonna like talk you guys through like a few countries and like the problems of like with regards to women laws in those countries, right? So the first one we're looking at is Afghanistan. So more than 4 decades of conflict and crisis combined with regressive gender norms have left many Afghan women and girls uneducated. So the reason why I'm doing this is because like it's important to give examples in the base, and these are some of the examples that you can use. So those those females who are allowed to attend school generally didn't stay for more than 2 years, and this reflects in the financial inclusion for women in the country. The country also ranks amongst the highest for gender-based violence, with around 35 out of every 100 women reportedly exposed to violence at the hands of an intimate partner. So along with countries like Pakistan, honor killings are still illegal here, but still widely prevalent within these countries. So despite it being illegal, they still occur. Then the next country we're going to look at is Syria, right? So before war broke out in Syria in 2011, gender dynamics were traditionally very patriarchal. Women only gained the right to vote in national elections in the mid-1950s, and while they were allowed to work, they made up a very small percent of the pre-war workforce. So many Syrian women, particularly in the country's then thriving middle class, opted to stay at home and just raise families, which aligns with the fact that marriage in the country is still seen as a contract between the husband and the wife's father rather than the husband and wife. It was only in 2020 that the country criminalized honor killings. 75 out of every 100,000 women are killed in organized violence, and only around 20% of women feel safe in their own communities, right? Then we can also look at South Sudan, where harmful gender norms has, as a result of patriarchal culture, have left women excluded from decision making and political activity. Women have few decision making powers within the household, and lack of resource ownership and land rights is at the heart of power imbalances between the genders. Then lastly, we'll look at Chad, where early and forced marriage is still very common. And early marriages, like it was reported that lots of people within Chad like just have this belief that early marriage is a custom within their community, right? Um, so the real danger for the girl is this idea of like getting pregnant, surgery, death, and even several cases of running away that existed, right? Okay, cool. So we've now reached the end of this, and I hope you guys learned something. Yeah, let's win nationals, guys. Cool. Thank you.